y'all, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie and I appreciate y'all stopping by. In today's video, I'm excited to share 22 easy to make bee and honey themed DIYs that are perfect for styling your tiered tray. Get ready to add a touch of sweetness and charm to your space with these adorable creations. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, and if you've not yet hit that subscribe button, what are you waiting for? Click that button and stick around for a bit. Also, be sure to stick around until the end to see how I used all of these projects to decorate my tiered tray. Let's go ahead and jump into the first project. For this project, I used this small ceramic gnome figure from the Dollar Tree and started by using Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster as a primer and gave it 2 good coats. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color maize to paint the shirt. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the belts, pants, and boots. I used apple barrel paint in the color sun-kissed peach to paint the gnome's face, ears, and hands. Once that was dry, I used Anita's acrylic paint in the color white to paint the eyes. To give him some pupils, I used the end of this paintbrush and Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. I dipped the end of the paintbrush into the paint and used it to stamp the pupil in the middle of each of the eyes. For the belt buckle, I used some antique gold rub and buff. Once all of the paint was completely dry, I took some jute twine and using hot glue as needed to secure it in place, wrapped it around the gnome's hat, making sure to curve it up and around his little hand and ears. I continued to wrap the jute around the hat until I had it completely wrapped, then cut off the excess jute and used hot glue to secure the end in place. After I had the hat wrapped, I took another piece of the jute and made a small circle on the front of the hat in the center about halfway up and again used hot glue as needed to secure it in place. This step is completely optional, but I personally don't like all of the fuzzies on the jute, so I took a lighter and carefully burnt them all off. Next, I used some Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the inside of the circle on the hat. I took 4 of these mini wooden ladybugs from this pack that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby and painted them to look like bees since my store did not have any of the mini bees in stock. Then, to finish up this little guy, I used hot glue to attach one of the bees to his hat at the opening of the hive, one on his elbow, another one at the top of his hat, and the last one on the tip of his boot. I absolutely love making over these little gnomes for my tiered trays, and I think that this one may just be my favorite one yet. Moving on to project number 2. For this project, I used this piece of scrap cardboard and this Beehive template that I traced off of the computer. I used a pencil to shade in the outline of the beehive on the back side, then taped it down onto the cardboard and traced around the image to transfer it onto the cardboard and carefully cut it out. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint both sides. After the paint was completely dry, I added an even layer of Mod Podge to the front of the hive and then placed this piece of yellow burlap that I think I got at Walmart on top and smoothed it out so that it was free of bumps and wrinkles. Once I had it in place, I went back over the top of the burlap with more Mod Podge, making sure to cover the hive completely and set it aside to fully dry. When the hive was completely dry, I cut off all of the excess burlap. I then took the template again and placed it down onto the hive and traced around the opening to transfer it onto the burlap, then used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to fill it in. After the paint was dry, I took some of this thicker jute twine from Walmart and used it to outline the opening of the hive using hot glue to secure it in place. Then, to finish up the edges of the hive, I took the same jute and used hot glue to attach it around the edges to give it a nice finished look. To add a little more detail to the hive, I used hot glue to attach pieces of the jute to the front to represent the different tiers and to give it more dimension. Next, I took 2 small sprigs of lavender and used hot glue to attach them to the upper corner of the hive on the top tier. I then made a simple shoestring bow using some thin jute and some yellow and white baker's twine from the Dollar Tree and used hot glue to attach it to the hive in the middle of the lavender pieces. It still looked unfinished, so I took one of these small wooden bees from this pack of mini wood icons that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby and painted it with plaster, ink, and maize chalk paints, then used hot glue to attach it to the center of the bow. Then to finish up this project, I took 2 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree and painted them with plaster chalk paint and used hot glue to attach them to the back of the hive at the bottom so that it would stand up on its own, and this one is finished. I think this turned out super cute, and best of all, it was extremely cheap and easy to make. Up next is project number 3. For this project, I used one of these 4.5 by 4.5 square wood planks from the 6-pack from the Dollar Tree and started by using Minwax wood finish in the color Golden Pecan to stain the entire plank. Next, I traced out this sweet like honey saying from my computer and shaded in the back side of the letters with a pencil to create a transfer. Once the plank was completely dry, I taped the template onto the front and traced over the letters to transfer them onto the wood. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to fill in the words sweet and like, and then used apple barrel paint in the color Golden Sunset to fill in the word honey. To add more detail to this sign, I took my glue gun and went along the top, applying hot glue to the edge to create dips in random shapes and sizes and set it aside to allow the glue to fully dry. After the glue was dry, I used apple barrel paint in the color Golden Sunset and painted it to look like honey. Next, I used this mold from Amazon, and I do have this listed in my storefront down below in the description box, and took my hot glue gun and filled up 2 of the flying bee molds, making sure to gently tap out all of the air bubbles and set it aside to allow the glue to fully harden. Once the glue had set up, I gently popped the bees out of the mold. Since I accidentally overfilled parts of the mold, I took a small pair of scissors and cut off any excess glue. I then used Waverly chalk paints in the color Plaster, Ink, and Maze to paint both of the bees. I took one of these mini honey dippers from Hobby Lobby and used hot glue to attach it to the empty space on the sign. I also used hot glue to attach a small shoestring bow right under the top of the dipper. Next, I used hot glue to attach one of the bees to the empty space on the left side of the sign and the other bee on the handle of the honey dipper. Then, to finish up this project, I used hot glue to attach 2 tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree that I had painted with plaster chalk paint to the back of the sign so that it would stand up on its own, and this one is finished. I'm really happy with the way this sign turned out. I think it's absolutely adorable. On to project number 4. For this project, I used 3 of these plastic mini round bowls from this 6-pack that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I started by using the 6-ply macrame jute cord from Hobby Lobby to wrap the outside of all 3 bowls using hot glue as needed to secure it in place and burnt off all of the twine fuzzies. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Maze to paint one of the bowls completely inside and out. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ink to paint the second bowl completely. And finally, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster to paint the last bowl completely, and this project is done. I think these turned out great. I wanted something to use as a large filler piece in the back of my tray, and these work perfectly. Moving on to project number 5. For this project, I used this small round glass bottle with a cork that I picked up at Hobby Lobby, along with this faux bee that I've had in my stash for a long time. I started by using Waverly chalk paints in the color Plaster, Ink, and Maze to repaint the bee to look a little more realistic. Next, I cut a piece of wire that was about 2 inches long and pushed the back of the bee down onto it just far enough so that the bee would stay in place. I then cut down the other end of the wire so that it would fit inside the glass bottle and pushed the wire down into the middle of the cork just far enough so that it stands on its own, then place the cork back into the top of the bottle, and this one is finished. I'm super happy with the way this one turned out. It was quick and easy to make and looks great on my tiered tray. Quickly moving on to project number 6. For this project, I used some of this wire jute from the Dollar Tree and cut a 13-inch piece. I then used it to create a small circle and used a pair of pliers to twist the 2 ends together to create a wreath form for this mini wreath. Next, I cut some of the lavender stems off of this lavender pick from Walmart and used hot glue to attach each of the stems to the outside of the wreath, facing all of the stems in the same direction all the way around and letting the stems overlap one another just a bit to fill in all of the gaps. I then took another one of these faux bees from my stash and again painted it to look a little bit more realistic, then used hot glue to attach it to the inside bottom section of the wreath, and this one is finished. This was another super quick and easy project, but it turned out super cute. On to project number 7. For this project, I started with this yellow gold 3/8 inch ribbon that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby and cut 4 pieces that are 2.5 inches long. Next, I took this white 3/8 inch ribbon from Hobby Lobby and cut 10 pieces at 2.5 inches long. Then I took this black 3/8 inch ribbon from Hobby Lobby and cut 4 pieces at 2.5 inches long. Once I had all of the ribbon pieces cut, I started forming them into the shape of a flower petal by making the shape of an awareness ribbon, then adding a small dab of hot glue to the front of one of the ends and place the other end on top and press them together. I continued to repeat this step until I had formed all of the ribbon pieces into petals. Next, I took a scrap piece of cardboard and an apple barrel paints bottle and placed it down in the center and traced around it and cut it out. I then used hot glue to attach all 10 of the white petals to the back side of the cardboard circle to create the back layer of the flower. Once I had the white petals in place, I used hot glue to attach the black petals to the front of the circle, placing the hot glue on the back side of the petal, then placing them so that they were positioned between the white petals. Next, I used hot glue to attach the yellow petals to the front of the circle between each of the black petals, again making sure to place the hot glue on the back side. This is how the flower should look once all of the petals are put into place. I used Waverly Antique Wax to stain one of these skewer sticks from the Dollar Tree, along with one of these wooden half beads from Amazon. Once the stain was completely dry, I used hot glue to attach the wooden half bead to the center of the flower. I then stuck the pointed end of the skewer inside the bottom of the flower between the corrugated pieces of the cardboard to create the stem, and this adorable little flower is finished. Because I wanted to make an arrangement of these ribbon flowers, I went ahead and repeated these steps to create a solid white, solid yellow, and solid black flower along with another tricolored flower. I'm thrilled with how these ribbon flowers turned out, and I can honestly see myself making some more of these in the future. Alright, on to project number 8. For this project, I used 4 of these large wooden beads from Amazon and started by using Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint 2 of them. I also used 2 more of the large wooden beads and painted them using Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Maze to paint 2 of these smaller wooden beads also from Amazon. I then took this mold and used hot glue to fill up one of the honeycomb pieces, making sure to tap out all of the air bubbles and set it aside to fully dry. Once the glue had set up, I removed the honeycomb from the mold and used some scissors to cut it down to the size and shape that I needed, and used apple barrel paint in the color Golden Sunset to completely paint it front and back. After the paint was completely dry, I took this piercing and scoring tool from the Dollar Tree and used it to poke a hole in the top of the honeycomb in the center. I took some black embroidery floss and fed it through the eye of a needle and pulled it so that it was doubled up, and then used the needle to feed it through the hole on the top of the honeycomb and slid the honeycomb down to the end of the floss, then tied it in a triple knot on the top edge and cut off the excess. Next, I strung the beads onto the floss in the order of white, yellow, black, then tied the floss in a triple knot against the top of the black bead and secured it in place with a small dab of hot glue. Then I cut the embroidery floss about 1 inch above the black bead and tied the 2 pieces in a knot to create a hanger and cut off any excess. I made a small shoestring bow using some black ribbon and used hot glue to attach it to the top of the honeycomb to cover up the hole. To finish up this project, I took one of these mini wooden ladybugs and painted it to look like a bee, then used hot glue to attach it to the honeycomb, and this one is finished. I love how this mini garland turned out. I've seen a lot of longer garlands for the tiered trays, but I think this will be perfect to hang over the edge of a bowl. Next up is project number 9. For this project, I used this 5-pack of mini glass containers from the Dollar Tree and some of these stickers that I had in my stash. I started by placing one letter on each of the 5 containers to spell out the word honey, trying to keep them as straight and even as possible when they were placed next to one another. Next, I used some of this clear Elmer school glue and squeezed a generous amount into a small plastic container, then took this apple barrel paint in the color Golden Sunset to create some faux honey. I dipped just the tip of a skewer stick into the paint, making sure not to pick up too much, and mixed it into the glue until it was completely mixed together and I was happy with the color. Remember, you can always add more paint if needed, but you can't remove it, so always start out light and add more until you're happy with the color. Once I was happy with the faux honey, I took a plastic spoon and filled up each of the glass containers, then replaced the lid, making sure it was nice and snug. Here's how the honey jars looked once I had them all filled. I thought they needed something a little extra, so I took some of this jute from Walmart and used hot glue to wrap each of the lids, and this project is finished. These little honey jars were extremely quick and easy to make and turned out exactly how I had envisioned them. Moving on to project number 10. For this project, I used this small 2.5 inch by 1.5 inch wide block that I had in my scrap wood stash and started by drilling a hole in the top with a small drill bit. I then took Waverly antique wax and stained the entire block. Once the block was completely dry, I taped off the edges with some thin washi tape and used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint the center. Next, I took this Let It Be template that I traced off my computer and shaded in the back side of the letters with a pencil, then taped it to the front of the block and traced the letters to transfer them. I then took a fine tip black Sharpie and went over each of the letters. Next, I cut a dowel rod from Dollar Tree down to about 2 inches and stained it using Waverly antique wax, and once it was dry, placed some hot glue down into the hole on the top of the block and stuck the dowel rod down inside. I cut a piece of wire about 2 inches long, folded it in half, and wrapped it around the dowel rod a couple of times to secure it in place and made sure each end of the wire was sticking out in opposite directions. Next, I cut a second piece of wire a little bit shorter, and this time I just wrapped one end around the top of the dowel a few times to secure it in place and made sure the other end was sticking straight up. This is how the piece looked once I had the wires secured in place. I then painted the wires with Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. I used 3 of these wooden bees out of this icon pack from Hobby Lobby and painted them with Waverly chalk paints in the color plaster, maize, and ink, making sure to paint the front and back of all 3 bees. Once the paint was completely dry, I used hot glue to attach one of the bees to the ends of each of the wires. I did go ahead and go back and apply more hot glue on the back side of each bee where it was attached to the wire to help secure it more in place, and this one is finished. I think this turned out absolutely adorable and adds a little height to my tiered tray. Let's jump into project number 11. For this project, I used this little wooden flower pot that is 2 inches tall and used Waverly antique wax to stain the outside. Next, I took one of these mini foam eggs from this package that I picked up at the Dollar Tree and placed it long ways onto a wooden skewer, then used Waverly chalk paints in the colors maize and ink to paint it to look like a bee. To make the wings, I used a small piece of an aluminum cookie sheet from the Dollar Tree and a template that I sketched out onto some cardstock and cut out. I placed the template down onto the cookie sheet and traced around it, then flipped it over to mirror the first wing and traced around the template again to create the second wing and cut them out. Once the bee was completely dry, I pushed the wings into the styrofoam, placing one on each side, using the back of the first black stripe as a guide. I took 2 of these small sequin pins from Hobby Lobby and pushed them into the front of the bee where it was painted solid black to create the eyes. Next, I took another one of the mini styrofoam eggs and placed it into the bottom of the flower pot, then took some reindeer moss from the Dollar Tree and tucked it down around the egg to cover the foam. To decorate this pot, I used 3 of the stems off of this white spike bush from the Dollar Tree and cut them apart so that I had 3 stems of flowers and 3 stems of the cones. Then I arranged them in the pot, pushing them down into the foam. Once I was happy with the way the arrangement looked, I cut the skewer stick down and placed the bee down in the center of the arrangement. Then to finish up this project, I made a simple shoestring bow using some jute twine and used hot glue to attach it to the front of the flower pot. This one was super quick and easy to put together, and I think it turned out darling. Okay, on to project number 12. For this project, I used another one of these mini foam eggs from the Dollar Tree and used some of this thicker jute twine from Walmart to wrap the entire egg, using hot glue as needed to secure it in place, making the pointed end of the egg just a tad bit longer. Next, I took the larger end of this cake decorating tool from the Dollar Tree and dipped it into some Waverly chalk paint in the color ink and used it to create the opening to the beehive. I also went out in my yard and found a piece of tree branch that had a fork at the top and a thicker base and used hot glue to attach the beehive to the bottom of the smaller branch. Then, to finish up this quick little project, I took another mini wooden ladybug and painted it to look like a bee and used hot glue to attach it to the front of the beehive, and this one is finished. I am absolutely in love with the way this little tree and beehive turned out. It may just be my favorite from all of today's projects. Up next is project number 13. For this project, I used this mini mason jar from the Dollar Tree and started by removing the lid, then using Waverly chalk paint in the color maize to paint the outside of the jar, applying it in a pouncing motion with a sponge brush. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the lid. Once everything was completely dry, I replaced the lid. Next, I designed and printed out this sunflower seeds label and cut it out. I applied an even thin layer of Mod Podge to the front of the jar and placed the label in the center and smoothed it out, making sure all of the edges were adhered to the jar. Then I took a sponge brush and more Mod Podge and went over the label as well as the rest of the jar, including the lid, in a pouncing motion to seal everything in place and set it aside to fully dry. I also want to say that I will leave a link to this printable in the description box below if you would like to print it out. Then, to finish off this project, I made this simple shoestring bow out of some jute ribbon and used hot glue to attach it to the front of the jar, and this one is finished. I think this turned out absolutely adorable and would also be perfect for a fall tiered tray as well. Quickly moving on to project number 14. For this project, I used one of these mini square bowls from the 6-pack that I picked up at the Dollar Tree and used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to completely paint the outside using a sponge brush and a pouncing motion. I also printed out this Farm Fresh honey label that I made on Canva and cut it out. I applied a thin, even layer of Mod Podge to the front of the bowl and placed the honey label in the middle and smoothed out all of the edges so that it was nice and smooth. Once I had the label in place, I went back over it with more Mod Podge and a sponge brush with a pouncing motion to seal it in place. I also went ahead and applied a thin layer of Mod Podge over the rest of the bowl to seal the paint. Again, I will leave a link to this printable in the description box below. Once everything was dry, I took my hot glue gun and applied hot glue along the top edge of the bowl all the way around to create the illusion of dripping honey and set it aside to fully dry. After the glue had set up, I used apple barrel paint in the color Golden Sunset to paint the faux honey drips, and this one is finished. I think this is a super simple and quick little project, but I think it turned out great. On to project number 15. For this project, I used this hexagon-shaped piece of wood from the Dollar Tree and started by using Waverly Antique Wax to completely stain it. Once the stain was dry, I took a finger sander and went around the edges to bring out the natural wood to add a bit of distressing. I also used this larger wood circle and this smaller wooden circle from this variety pack that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the smaller wooden circle and Waverly chalk paint in the color maize to paint the larger wooden circle. Once the paint was dry on the large circle, I used washi tape to section out a stripe in the center of the circle and used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint it. Next, I used 2 of these decorative hearts from this pack of laser cut wood icons from the Dollar Tree and used Waverly chalk paint and the color plaster to paint the front and back of both hearts. I placed a larger circle in the center of the hexagon, then used hot glue to attach the smaller circle to the front, overlapping just a bit. I then used hot glue to attach the larger circle to the middle of the hexagon, and then used hot glue to attach the 2 hearts to either side of the circle to create the wings, using the black stripe as a guide and pushing the points of the 2 hearts together. Next, I cut 2 pieces of wire, roughly 2 inches long, then used a pair of pliers to curl one end of each of the wires to create the antenna for the bee. I then used Waverly chalk paint and the color ink to paint them. Then to finish up this project, I used hot glue to attach the antenna underneath the bee's head, and this one is finished. I really love the way this one turned out. It's a bit different but super cute. Let's move on to project number 16. For this project, I used one of these foam die from this 2-pack that I picked up at the Dollar Tree, as well as 3 of these Snow White balloons from this package that I picked up at the Dollar General. I started by cutting off the neck of one of the balloons right at the base where the balloon starts to widen, then stretched it over the die, making sure the opening of the balloon was going to be on the bottom. I then repeated this step to place the other 2 balloons over the die again, making sure the openings on both balloons were on the same side on the bottom. Then, to make sure the balloons stay in place, I pulled the edges over to seal the holes and added 2 pieces of Scotch tape over the top in an X shape. I then used a pencil to draw on a cute little face on the front of the die, and then used a fine-tip Sharpie to go over the top of it to darken it up. Next, I used one of these small straw hats that I picked up at Hobby Lobby, as well as some of this jute trim with leaves that I also got at Hobby Lobby. I measured out how much of the trim I needed to wrap around the brim of the hat and cut it to size, and remove the leaf ribbon from the jute. I then attached the leaf ribbon around the brim of the hat, using hot glue as needed to secure it in place. I also used this white daisy that I found in my scrap stash. I used a small pair of scissors to poke a hole in the side of the hat near the back, then applied hot glue to the stem of the daisy and placed it down inside the hole. Next, I took 3 of the mini wooden ladybugs from Hobby Lobby and painted them to look like bees, and used hot glue to attach one to a flower petal, one to the top of the hat in the front, and then the last one to the brim of the hat. Then, to finish this project, I used hot glue to attach the hat to the top of the die, and this one is done. I think this little foam marshmallow turned out super cute. I do wish the hat was a tad bit bigger, but I'm quite happy with it just as it is. Up next, project number 17. For this project, I used 4 of these small wooden cubes from the Dollar Tree and took a small drill bit and drilled a hole all the way through the center of each cube. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color maize to paint them. I also used 5 of these small wooden beads from Amazon and used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint them. Once the paint was dry, I used these letter stickers and placed 1 letter on each of the cubes to spell out the word buzz. Next, I took some white cotton twine from the Dollar Tree and fed it through the eye of a large needle, then tied a double knot in the opposite end. I then strung the beads and the cubes onto the twine in the order of bead, Z cube, bead, other Z cube, bead, U cube, bead, B cube, and then bead, and then tied the end of the twine tightly in a loop against the last bead and cut off the excess twine, and this one is finished. I love this mini garland. It was super quick and easy to make and looks adorable on my tray. Moving on to project number 18. For this project, I used one of these small plastic candy jars from this 2-pack that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I started by removing the lid and used Waverly chalk paint and the color ink to paint it. Once the paint was dry, I used this yellow gold ribbon from Hobby Lobby and used hot glue to attach it around the edge of the lid, trying to get it as centered as possible. Next, I used this clear Elmer school glue and this apple barrel paint in the color Golden Sunset. I dipped the end of a skewer stick into the paint, removed the excess, and then mixed it into the glue, making sure it was thoroughly mixed to create faux honey. Once I was happy with the color of the honey, I squeezed a generous amount of the glue into the bottom of the candy jar and replaced the lid. I also used one of these wooden tags from this package that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby, as well as this stamp set along with this stamp block from the Dollar Tree. I used the stamps to spell out the word honey and used black ink to stamp it onto the blank side of the tag. After the ink was dry, I fed a piece of jute twine through the top of the tag and tied it around the neck of the jar, making sure the word honey was visible, then cut off the excess jute. Then to finish up this project, I used 3 of these larger wooden beads from the Dollar Tree and used hot glue to attach one to the top of the lid to cover up where the ribbon was glued together, followed by one on the side of the jar and the last one on the front of the lid, and this one is finished. This was another super quick and easy one that looks amazing on my tiered tray. Jumping right into project number 19. For this project, I used 3 of these large wooden beads from Amazon and used Waverly chalk paints in the color maize and in the color ink to paint them to look like bee bodies. I also used 3 of these medium wooden beads from Amazon and started by using hot glue to fill in one of the holes. Then when it had fully set up, used Waverly chalk paint and the color ink to paint them. Once the paint was completely dry, I used hot glue to attach one of the black beads to the top of one of the yellow and black beads, making sure to line up the open holes. I then repeated this step to attach the other 2 black beads to the other 2 yellow and black beads. Next, I took one of these skewer sticks from the Dollar Tree and cut 3 pieces that were roughly 2.5 inches long. I then took 3 of these wooden cubes from the Dollar Tree and used a small drill bit to drill a small hole in the top of each cube. To assemble these bees, I applied some hot glue to one end of one of the skewer pieces and placed it inside of one set of beads. Then repeated this step to attach one to each of the bead sets. I then applied hot glue to the other side of the skewer stick and placed it down inside the hole on the top of one of the wooden cubes, then repeated this step to attach the other bees to the wooden cubes. Then to finish up this project, I made 3 small shoestring bows using some jute twine and cut off all of the tails, then used hot glue to attach one to each of the bees at the base of the head to cover the seams where the 2 beads are glued together, and this one is done. I absolutely love how these little bees turned out. They took no time at all to make, and they look wonderful on my tray. Next up, project number 20. For this project, I used this hanging wood sign from the Dollar Tree and started by using Waverly antique wax to stain the front and back. Once the sign was completely dry, I used washi tape to tape off a border along the outside edge of the sign and used Waverly chalk paint in the color lavender to paint the border. Next, I used these wooden letters from Hobby Lobby to spell out the word honey and used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint just the front side of each letter. I also used another one of these small wooden bees from Hobby Lobby and painted it using Waverly chalk paints in the colors maize, ink, and plaster. Once all the paint was completely dry, I used hot glue to attach the letters to the front of the sign in the middle, using a ruler to help keep them spaced evenly and straight. Next, I used hot glue to attach the bee to the top of the sign in the center. After I had everything in place, I added a jute hanger and tied the knots on the front of the sign. Then I hot glued 2 tumbling tower blocks to the back so that it would stand on its own. Then to finish up this project, I twisted the jute into a loop at the top of the sign and used hot glue to secure it in place, and this one is finished. I just love how this one turned out. It's perfect for the top of my tiered tray, but can also be used in other areas as decor. On to project number 21. For this project, I used 2 of these 2-inch wooden flower pots that I had in my stash. I started by using Waverly chalk paint in the color maize to paint one of the pots and made a simple shoestring bow using some thin black ribbon, then used hot glue to attach it to the front of the pot. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the second pot and made another simple shoestring bow using the yellow gold ribbon and used hot glue to attach it to the front of the pot. To finish up these pots, I used 2 of these wooden beads from the Dollar Tree and used hot glue to attach one to the center of each of the bows, and this one is finished. I decided to use some scrap florals that were purple and yellow to fill these pots, and I absolutely love the simplicity of these. And last but not least, project number 22. For this project, I used 4 of these 4.5-inch wooden blocks from this package from Hobby Lobby. I started by using Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint 2 of the blocks, and once they were dry, I placed these 2 letters that I traced out from my computer and shaded in the back on the front, and traced over the letters to transfer them to the blocks, then used Waverly chalk paint in the colored plaster to fill them in. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color maize to paint one of the other blocks, and once the paint was dry, I placed this Z I traced and shaded in on the front and traced over it to transfer it to the block, then used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to fill it in. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint the last block. I then took this last small wood bee from this pack that I picked up at Hobby Lobby and painted it using Waverly chalk paints in the colors ink, maize, and plaster. Once the paint was dry, I used hot glue to attach the bee to the front of the white block. Then, to finish up this project, I used hot glue to attach the 4 blocks together to spell out the word buzz, using the bee to represent the letter U, and this one is finished. This was super simple and easy to put together, but I think it turned out great. Thank you all for joining me on this creative journey filled with beautiful DIYs for my tiered tray. I hope you enjoyed the video and found inspiration to add a touch of sweetness to your own tiered tray. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on my future DIY adventures. Remember, creativity is a hive of endless possibilities, so keep buzzing with ideas and let your imagination soar. Until next time, stay inspired, stay creative, and keep spreading joy one DIY project at a time. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.